June the 4th, 1989 is really a pivotal moment in Chinese history. Hundreds and possibly thousands killed by soldiers of the People's Liberation Army on the orders of Deng Xiaoping, who was at the time China's paramount leader. The common understanding of this movement in the West is that it was, for the most part, a student movement and that it was a pro-democracy movement. Usually that's interpreted to mean liberal democracy. In other words, they wanted to have a government more like ours. This way of telling the story of a struggle between democracy and communism or socialism is really a reflection of the historical period in which the movement took place. In other words, the Cold War. It was a time in which the world was understood, in the West at least, in terms of bad communist governments and good liberal democracies. The powerful image of this statue in the square seemed to back up that idea. This statue was put up by some art students and was nicknamed the Goddess of Democracy, a clear reference to the Statue of Liberty in New York. Photos of this image, unsurprisingly, circulated widely in international media. But a well-known scholar in China wrote about what drove this movement and argued that it was very different from the account so often portrayed in the West. This is Wang Hui. He's a professor of Chinese intellectual history at the famous Tsinghua University in Beijing. Wang Hui is well known for being one of a group of scholars nicknamed the New Left. They were very well known in the 1990s and early 2000s for being very critical of China's market reforms. In an article published in 2004, Wang Hui argued that the movement in Tiananmen Square was far more complicated than most accounts had presented it. He said, "We can't understand what happened unless we understand the social and economic difficulties which Chinese people had been experiencing throughout the 1980s as a result of the market reforms." One of the key things that had happened in the course of the reforms was that political power had been decentralized to local governments. And the careers of government officials were now being evaluated by how much they were able to promote economic growth in their local areas. As a result, some of them had become quite zealous, both about promoting economic growth and also about lining their own pockets. So many were engaging in various forms of corruption and managing to get quite a lot of wealth for themselves. As this was going on, a lot of ordinary people were facing economic hardships that they hadn't faced before and they weren't used to, because people weren't used to living in a market economy. China had been under Maoist socialism since the 1950s. Now, as the market reforms are taking place, there are economic activities going on which haven't happened before. For one thing, people in the cities had stable employment before. They had a job guaranteed for life by the state. So they couldn't choose their jobs or move jobs when they wanted, but they had a stable livelihood for themselves and their families. Now this system is breaking down. People are being moved onto temporary employment contracts and they're starting to be laid off. On top of this, the economy is monetizing. That means there's more money going into it. There are loans coming from banks, there's overseas investment coming in, and there's a dual-track pricing system. That means not all pricing is planned by the state anymore. Some market pricing has been introduced for some products. So prices are starting to go up, higher than they've been before, at the same time that people are losing their jobs. This dual-track price system is also one of the main ways that corruption is taking place. It's being manipulated to make private profit by the people who are in control of the resources. In other words, people in positions of political power are buying goods at planned prices and selling at market prices and pocketing the difference. All of these changes are leading to higher growth rates, but it's also leading to inflation. So the amount of money that people have is losing its value. So people are experiencing increasing insecurities in their lives while at the same time witnessing growing income disparities as those around them in positions of power are getting rich, often through corrupt means. So unsurprisingly, many people are beginning to lose faith in the market reforms and to question whether the state actually does represent their interests. Wang Hui pointed out that while most accounts of the movement focused mainly on the students, In fact, the demonstrators included manual workers, state officials, individual entrepreneurs, teachers, all kinds of occupations, and people from every urban social class. And all of them had been living through these major social upheavals. One of the tragedies of the movement, Wang says, is that the students and intellectuals who actually did emerge as the movement's figureheads were unable to really grasp the reasons that the movement had such mass appeal. He says that while many of the demonstrators certainly were calling for democracy, the movement's leaders really didn't understand what kind of democracy they meant, or how these calls for democracy resulted from the disruptions in people's lives caused by the market reforms. They only understood what was going on within this limited Cold War ideological framework which pitted democracy and socialism against each other as if they were fundamentally at odds. But they didn't really interrogate what was actually meant by democracy or by socialism. They seem to have simply assumed that socialism meant more top-down state planning. They didn't realise that it could also mean greater social protections from the rampages of the market and more just distribution of resources. In other words, democratic management over how resources are distributed and who gets what. In fact, many demonstrators did not want a capitalist-style liberal democracy and market economy like in Europe and America. Instead, they wanted a stronger and better kind of socialism, a socialist kind of democracy. Most of the reports in the West completely missed that. Wang Hui argues that since those with the loudest voices within the movement had no coherent understanding of this either, they weren't able to put forward concrete, practical solutions to solve any of these problems. In all of the confusion, a set of special interest groups, people who actually had been profiting from the processes of marketisation, were able to use their political connections to the state to have their own set of demands heard by certain very high-up policymakers. For this special interest group, democracy didn't mean more social protections or more socially just distribution of resources. It meant the further removal of resources from state control. In other words, more liberalisation of the economy and more radical privatisation. The irony, of course, is that according to Wang Hui, this is exactly what many people had been protesting against. On June the 4th, the movement in Tiananmen Square was violently put to an end, and for a while this did serious damage to China's international reputation, and the market reforms stalled. The country faced a couple of years of economic stagnation as policymakers at the top levels of the party tussled over what to do next. Some of them wanted to return to more central state planning to provide better protections for people's livelihoods. But in 1992, Deng Xiaoping made the decision to circumvent all these policy debates. Instead, he went on a widely publicised tour of China's special economic zones in the south. With a lot of state publicity, he called for an acceleration of the market reforms, and he called out to the international community for more foreign investment. This is known as Deng's Southern Tour. And here's a well-known poster from that time. For Wang, the violence of June the 4th did not end the gradual movement towards liberal democracy in China, which is how it's so often presented. Instead, it crushed the resistance to the market reforms. Afterwards, the state was able to put into practice more radical policies of privatisation and economic liberalisation than had been possible in the 1980s. Following Deng's southern tour, the 1990s and 2000s saw China's growth really begin to take off. And with it, lots of much wealthier people and also very high levels of social inequality. Several scholars have argued, and I probably agree with them, that June the 4th is really the point at which socialism, in any meaningful sense, came to an end in China. Thank you for watching.